This, for some reason, this mic doesn't want to work today, so I'm using the mic on my PC, so it's a lot noisier. This one's much easier to hear. So, I do apologize for that. So, chapter 29. We're going to talk about what constitutes demand pull inflation as well as cost push inflation. And we're going to show both of those things graphically. We're then going to talk about different types of inflation and how that's related to basically bigger economic concepts. So we're going to talk about things like an inflationary spiral, and we're also going to talk about business cycles. So we'll see how different kinds of inflation can correspond to different components of the business cycle and basically be indicative of the cycle themselves. Then we're going to introduce something called the Phillips Curve, and the Phillips Curve is a way of illustrating both the short run and long run trade-offs between inflation and unemployment. And then finally we'll just kind of give a review on some business cycle theory. So, introducing something called an inflation cycle, and we're going to talk about two different types of inflation and related inflation cycles. And those are, number one, demand pull inflation, and then number two, cost push inflation. So in chapter 28, having put together our ASAD model, bringing together the labor market, bringing together the aggregate expenditure goods market side of things, and the money markets, means that we can now start looking at our economy as a sort of a big organism, I guess. And the things that happen in that economy are growth and inflation. Those are sort of aggregate measures of what's happening. So what is demand pull inflation and how does it happen? Well, demand pull inflation is inflation that starts because aggregate demand increases. So in our diagram here we have initially an increase in aggregate demand. Why might aggregate demand increase? We spoke about that in chapter 28. Remember that the factors of aggregate demand are C, I, G, X, M. Yeah? And taxes as well is thrown in there. So if you have an increase in consumption, or you have an increase in government spending, or an increase in investment, an increase in exports, or a decrease in imports, any of those are going to shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. With an increase in our aggregate demand, you will recall as well from chapter 28 when we spoke about shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve. The shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve is primarily, or at least in terms of our course, the one that we're most interested in, is the labor market response to a change in prices. And the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve comes from a change in labor's expectations about prices. So what happens once we have an increase in aggregate demand? We have an increase in prices. What does that increase in prices do? Well, it triggers a money-wage response. With an increase in prices, what happens to real wages if money wages remain constant? If money wages are constant, but prices go up, what happens to real wages? Real wages go down. Then people get unhappy with working for real wages that are lower. So what do? They start demanding higher money wages or higher nominal wages. Okay? So there's a money wage rate response. The money wage rate begins to rise, and the short run aggregate supply curve decreases. So we had an increase in aggregate demand, The response on the supply side is a shift to the left in aggregate supply. Why? Because there is a money wage response to the decrease in nominal wages. To the decrease in real wages. Why do real wages decrease? Because prices have increased. And we're assuming that this, if we've got a short-run aggregate supply curve, we're assuming there's some sort of stickiness in the wage response, in the nominal wage response. Okay? With a shift to the left in the short run aggregate supply curve, what happens? Well, there's a further increase in prices. Okay, so the price level rises further and real GDP begins to decrease. Okay, so we move from point A to point B, then from point B we move to point C. So a demand pull inflation process. For inflation to proceed, aggregate demand must persistently increase. The only way it can do so is if the quantity of, well, the argument here is that the quantity of money persistently increases. Okay, that's fine, but that's part of the story. In other words, why is there an increase in the quantity of money? Well, maybe the increase in the quantity of money is in response to, say, an increase in government spending, or an increase in demand for money because consumers want to spend more, right? So what do we see in this process? We have aggregate demand increasing prices. That increase in prices prompts a further increase in prices when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. From our new equilibrium point C, what happens now if aggregate demand increases once again? Prices go up further, aggregate supply shifts to the left once again, prices go up even further. So if there's constant pressure on the demand side, right, demand is constantly increasing, maybe because government is continuously wanting to spend more and more, right? We'll take a look at an example of that tomorrow when we look at South Africa's government budget, right? We'll see that over the last few years there's just been a continuous increase in government spending above tax collection, right? Just continuous increases in government spending, which is then a continuous increase in aggregate demand. If we don't have a shift in the long run aggregate supply, remember that a shift in the long run aggregate supply is associated with an increase in output, increase in production, increase in employment, right? That's economic growth. The shift in the long run aggregate supply, economic growth, would shift the short run aggregate supply as well. They both move together, and that would be lowering prices, right? So if we have a continuous increase in government spending, a continuous increase in aggregate demand, but without any economic growth, without any increase in output, what can we expect to see? Just continuous increases in prices. And that would become, well, that's what we would call demand pull inflation. And if it just continues and continues, we can get into a demand pull inflation spiral. So inflation just spirals out of control, which is essentially what happened in the Zimbabwean case, what now, about, how long ago was that? 10 years ago? I don't know. About 10 years ago. Was continuous demand side pressure from the government without economic growth. And you had an inflationary spiral, which got completely out of control. So that's one way in which we can end up with inflation. But there's a second way in which we can end up with inflation, which is a little bit problematic. Well, let's say it's much harder to deal with than the first one. Much harder to deal with than demand pull inflation. So cost push inflation is inflation that is kicked off by an increase in the costs of production. And there are two main sources of cost increases on your production side. Obviously, we know that from the labor side of things, there can be the money wage rate, so any kind of increase in prices, in the price of labor. But also we can have increases in the prices of any other raw materials. So if, for example, we had an increase in the price of petrol, okay? So, or let's not say petrol, let's say oil, because that's what you normally, petrol is derived from oil, obviously. So if you have an increase in the price of oil, you're going to have an increase in the price of petrol, then you have a shift to the left of your short-run aggregate supply curve. The costs of producing increase when oil prices rise. So if our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left because of an increase in input costs, what might happen? Well, what we know is going to happen, is first of all, prices are going to increase and output is going to decrease. Okay? Shift to the left in aggregate supply, prices increase, output decreases. What might then happen in response is we could have an aggregate demand response. Okay? In other words, we enter into a recession and government decides that this is politically not a good thing and they increase spending or they relax monetary policy. Okay? So there's an increase in aggregate demand. With the increase in aggregate demand, what do we end up with? Well, our output recovers, output increases, but prices increase even more. All right? Now, depending on why the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left, and depending on why aggregate demand curve is shifting to the right, is going to determine whether this kind of situation also ends up in an inflationary spiral or not. Let's say that this shift to the left in short-run aggregate supply was due to an increase in the price of oil. When government increases aggregate demand, does that change the price of oil? Doesn't do anything to address the increased costs of production from an increase in oil, right? So what do we end up with? Well, we end up with prices going up because of an increase in demand, okay? But if the oil price continues to increase, what do we end up with? Our supply curve shifts to the left again. Then government would respond by increasing aggregate demand again. But if the oil price just continues to increase, what do we end up with? An inflationary spiral where we have a short-run supply side increase in prices followed by a demand side increase in prices and a supply side with the demand side and so the thing and so we end up with basically very low growth and high inflation, and that's called stagflation, okay, which is stagnant growth, high inflation, stagflation. And that was a big problem in the so we say the developed economies during the 1970s. There was a big period of stagflation when oil prices were rising. When OPEC, which is the oil producing cartel, or whatever, I don't know what the E stands for, I can't remember, oil producing economies or something, I don't know. OPEC managed to control oil supply and they basically decreased it, which sent the price of oil skyrocketing, and you had stagflation. So this is how we end up with a cost push inflation spiral. It starts on the supply side. Okay. So here's just a diagram of our inflation spiral. And of course, if it's happening from the labor side of things, in other words, if the supply, the aggregate supply curve is shifting because of wages, then this entire inflationary spiral will have a lot to do with expectations. So one of the key strategies of the Reserve Bank is to manage inflation expectations. The Reserve Bank communicates all the time about what it thinks is going to happen in the future, what it thinks it's going to do with interest rates in the future. So every meeting, there's an MPC meeting quite frequently, sometimes monthly, right? They will either choose to change interest rates or keep them on hold. But no matter what they do, when they've made their decision, they will also communicate what they expect their future decision to be. So they'll say, we're leaving interest rates on hold today, right, for this period, but we've been looking at the economic data and there's a lot to indicate that inflationary pressures are, relaxing. And if that trend continues, then we will have impetus to lower interest rates in the near future. So that's the kind of message that they will send. Then if you watch the data and you track what's happening, you can get an idea of what the Reserve Bank will do in the next MPC meeting. So markets, the Reserve Bank doesn't want to surprise markets, put it that way, right? They want to manage inflation expectations. And it's important because expectations are the kind of thing that can fuel an inflationary spiral. If you can manage expectations, you can, in theory, control an inflationary spiral. So how is this then related to the business cycle? When the inflation forecast is correct, then the economy operates roughly at full employment. Right? Remember, it's when our inflation expectations deviate from actual inflation that we end up away from full employment. Right? So when our inflation forecast is correct, then we will be at approximately full employment. If, however, for example, aggregate demand grows faster than expected, then what would happen? Real GDP would rise above potential GDP. The inflation rate would exceed the expected inflation rate, and the economy behaves like it does with demand pull inflation. In other words, we end up with this situation, which then gets met by an increase in production costs and more inflation. So that's what the Reserve Bank wants to try and avoid. So it wants to try and ensure that people's inflation expectations match reality. Of course, from the other side of things, if the aggregate demand grows slower than expected, real GDP falls below potential GDP, and then we could have either the inflation rate slowing or, even worse, deflation. Deflation is not a good thing. Deflation is not a good thing. And the main reason why deflation is not a good thing, if you can think about it like this, is you are a firm and you employ laborers and you pay them a wage expecting to sell your product at a certain price, which will give you a profit. Now imagine that price at which you are selling suddenly falls. Your laborers are happy in the sense that, okay, their real wage is higher, but what's happened to your business profits? You're now making a loss. That's not sustainable. What do? You lay off laborers, right? Especially if your money wage rate is fixed. You can't drop wages, so instead of dropping wages, you retrench, right? So you don't want deflation because that's bad for business sustainability. So what you really want, if anything, is a little bit of inflation, but you want it low and you want it stable, and then you're happy. Now, what we're going to introduce here is something called the Phillips Curve, and the Phillips Curve is the relationship between, with the Phillips Curve we plot inflation versus unemployment. Okay? If we are plotting unemployment versus inflation, you'll see that's kind of like the inverse of our ASAD model, because if we're plotting real GDP, remember, real GDP and employment are closely linked. So we're kind of plotting here employment, if you can think about it, employment against price level. Yeah? The more GDP we have, the more employment we have. You with me? Okay? So that's what our aggregate supply curve relationship is telling us, that as the price level goes up, the amount of output we produce is going to increase. And how are we going to produce more output? By employing more people. You with me? So in this ASAD space, our short-run aggregate supply curve is telling us about a relationship between price level and employment. Saying at higher price levels, we're prepared to employ more people. Are you with me? Okay. What is our Phillips curve plotting? Our Phillips curve is plotting unemployment, unemployment versus inflation. And you'll see that we have this short run Phillips curve which is downward sloping. And what is this short run Phillips curve telling us? And you'll see it's telling us basically the same thing that the aggregate supply curve is telling us. What it's telling us is the following. At higher inflation rates, in other words, when prices are increasing, the unemployment rate is decreasing. So with higher prices, we are employing more people. Our unemployment rate is decreasing. Are you with me? It's kind of the same as the short run aggregate supply curve. It's just the mirror image. Because we're not plotting employment, we're now plotting unemployment. Right? Higher prices, higher employment, or lower unemployment. You with me? So this is a supply side story. This is not demand side, right? This is the supply side of things. Okay? And the Phillips curve tells us a nice story in theory, although the data suggests that the theory itself is not, there's something missing. It's not this neat. The real world relationship is not as neat as what this theory would like you to think it is. So an alternative to the ASAD model is the Phillips curve, which is a simpler tool than ASAD model, and in a sense providing clearer insights, okay, into the short run trade-off between inflation and real economic activity, in other words output and employment. Okay. The short run Phillips curve shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and here's what's important. We are holding constant for now the expected inflation rate as well as the natural unemployment rate. So the natural unemployment rate, remember, that's full employment. So if we're holding full employment constant, if we're holding the natural unemployment rate constant, means we're holding our long run aggregate supply curve constant, right? We're not shifting it. Okay? So we're holding our capital, we're holding our population and all those other things constant. Okay? We're dealing with the short run for now. So the short run, we hold inflation expectations constant as well as all the other things that would affect long run growth, long run economic growth. So the short run Phillips curve tells us the following. We can plot an initial point. Let's say that if everyone expects inflation, so expected inflation is 10%. Okay? So we go into a wage bargaining council and we demand wages. We demand that our wages next period increase by 10% at least because we expect inflation to increase by 10%. You with me? Yeah? So we go in to the beginning of the year expecting inflation to be 10%. And at 10% we are at the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, we are at full employment and it's going to be 6% in this example. Obviously in the South African example, that would probably be a lot higher. But we can plot now, everyone's expecting 10%. If inflation is actually 10%, we end up at full employment at the natural unemployment rate. And here we're going to, the example here is 6%. So we can plot a point A. The relationship between inflation and the natural unemployment rate, and the rate of unemployment. And what we're saying is we're at the natural rate of unemployment when our expected inflation rate matches what is in reality inflation. So inflation is 10%, we expect it to be 10%. What do we know from our ASAD model? We will be at full employment. Right? With me? Okay. What happens if we expected inflation to be 10%, but we got it wrong? Inflation was actually much higher. Let's go back to our ASAD model. Remember, we set our wages, and our short-run aggregate supply is with our nominal wages fixed, and our nominal wages are fixed given our expectation of inflation. Yes? Okay? So we expected 10% inflation, but guess what? Aggregate demand increased by more than what we had expected, which meant that prices increased by more than what we had expected. So the inflation rate was higher than what we had expected. Remember what happens? We move from point A to point B. Our real wages fall. Inflation is slightly higher than we expected. And what happens to the amount of output we produce? It increases. So what is happening to our unemployment rate if our output is increasing? Our unemployment rate is decreasing. So what does the Phillips curve tell us? Same thing. Again, just in a much simpler way. Well, much simpler depending on what you want to do with it, but yeah. Okay. What happens? The inflation rate. What happens if the actual inflation rate is, say, 13%, and we expected 10%? We expect 10%, but inflation is higher than what we expected. We move from point A to point B, and point B, and what do we know about point B? The unemployment rate is lower, and the inflation rate is higher than what we expected. Why is unemployment lower? Well, we saw that. What happened? We moved from point A to point B. We started employing more people. Why? Because with a fixed money wage, real wages had fallen slightly. Yeah? Okay. So here we go. We move from point A to point B because inflation is higher than expected. But when inflation is higher than our expected inflation at the beginning of the period, what happens the next time we come to negotiate our wages? We don't sit there and say, well, we expected inflation 10% last year. It was actually 13%. So this year, why don't we just expect it to be 10% again? Right? That's not how you do things. You're like, well, inflation was 13%, my real wage has gone down. This time I want my wage to go up by at least 13%. Prices went up by 13%. My wage should go up by 13%. Because if the prices went up by 13% last period, why won't they just go up 13% this period? Right? So what happens then if our expectations of inflation increase and our higher expected inflation is correct? Next period we do actually have 13% inflation. What kind of relationship will we have, or how would we plot our level of unemployment versus our level of inflation? Well, our expected inflation rate has changed from 10% to 13%. And if our new expected inflation rate of 13% matches the actual inflation rate of 13%, we will end up at full employment. In other words, we will end up at the natural rate of unemployment, but with higher inflation expectations. Right? So now we've moved to a point over here, we call it point D, which is no longer on this short-run Phillips curve relationship. Right? So if we are correct, inflation is in fact 13%, and we expect inflation to be 13%, we will be at the natural rate. However, if we expect inflation to be 13%, we negotiate higher wages expecting 13%, but inflation is actually 16%, then what happens? Well, at a 16% inflation rate, right, inflation is higher than what we anticipated. What is going to happen to employment? It's going to actually increase because lower wages have real wages have decreased, which means our unemployment rate will actually decrease, right? So we will have another point, for example, at 16, where we have some lower level of unemployment. We can call it point E, and you'll see we have a totally different short-run Phillips curve. Short-run Phillips curve. In other words, this initial short-run Phillips curve short run Phillips curve 0 is the relationship that we have when we hold constant our expected inflation. When we change our expectations of inflation, what do? We shift the short run Phillips curve. You got it? In the long run, though, no matter what our expected inflation rate is, in the long run, if our expected inflation rate matches the actual inflation rate, we will be at the natural rate of unemployment, right? So in the long run, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, right? As long as our expectations match the inflation rate, we will always be at the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, the long run Phillips curve says there's no relationship between the inflation rate and the level of employment. Doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, as long as our expectations of that inflation rate are correct, we will always be at the natural rate of unemployment. So the long run Phillips curve says there's no relationship between inflation rate and unemployment rate. We have a vertical long run Phillips curve. And the long run Phillips curve corresponds to what we've already seen, a long run aggregate supply curve that's vertical. Why is the long run aggregate supply curve vertical? Remember, the position of the long run aggregate supply curve, it doesn't matter what people's expectations of inflation are in the long run. What matters for the position of the long run aggregate supply curve is production side, things like the amount of the population, the amount of laborers that we have, the capital, the level of technology, right? The amount of raw materials. Those are the things that determine where our long run aggregate supply curve is, not what our expected inflation rate is, right? So if the long run aggregate supply curve is the same as the full employment level of employment, right? We're at full employment in the long run when we're on the long run aggregate supply curve. If the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at full employment, then our long run Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. So can you see that the long run Phillips curve and the short run Phillips curve are kind of the mirror image of short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply? The only difference is that it's swapped around because we've swapped our axis around. So it's literally like it's in a mirror. Okay? So as long as you understand the aggregate supply discussion that we've had last week about why the aggregate supply curve slopes upwards, the short run aggregate supply curve, and why it shifts when there's a change in money wages. If you understand that and that discussion, then the Phillips curve is the same thing. It's the same discussion. Okay? You get the one, you get the other one. It's the same story. Okay? Any questions? So the model that we're really interested in is the ASAD model. And we've seen that the Phillips curve is just another way of looking at the supply side of things. It's another way of looking at the AS component of our aggregate supply model, of our ASAD model. So if we return then to our ASAD model and we try to understand the business cycle, then what we're going to end up with is, in the long run, we're going to have shifts. So in the long run, we're going to have shifts of not only the short run aggregate supply curve and the AD curve, but also shifts in the long run aggregate supply curve. In other words, with changes in capital and changes in technology and changes in population, immigration or birth rates, etc., we're going to have shifts in the long run aggregate supply. So what we can see here is, in this diagram, we've got some period of time, call this like T0. This is some year, let's call it, I don't know, 2000. And then here we've got T1, and let's say that T1 is, I don't know, 2010. Okay? So what do we see has happened in that period of time? A number of things have happened. First of all, we have increased GDP. GDP has increased. We've had economic growth over time, right? We've also had an increase in prices, okay? Depending on where we are, let's assume we're at point D, then we've actually moved to, our output has grown even more, right? What do we have? We have economic growth, which would be point B, we would be in a long run equilibrium. Point D, a short run equilibrium. When we compare point D to, say, our initial point A, point D has had economic growth. There has been economic growth, but we've also had aggregate demand growing faster than aggregate supply, growing faster than long run aggregate supply. So we've had an increase in prices. Okay? So we're using our ASAD model to illustrate why in the long run we can have economic growth and have inflation at the same time. Right? The long run trend here has been growth, but in the short run we have expanded we've expanded faster than what we have grown. So our aggregate demand side has expanded faster than our supply side, which means we are also going to have more than likely going to experience a small recession in the near future. Even though we've had long run growth, we're going to have had a small recession. So what would this look like if we were going to plot this in a business cycle space? We had here output over time. We would have a long run growth trend. So this is the long run growth trend, and we've had movements, and this point D would correspond to point like point D there, right? And maybe point A over here was where we started. Let's say we started at point A and point A was over there. So we've had growth, we've had inflation, we're also above potential, which means we're probably going to enter into a recession. Okay? So our ASAD model is nice for explaining something that we see in reality, which is a wavy GDP line that looks like that, kind of increasing over time.